Okay, so now let's go from talking about police to talking about destruction of property. There are reasonable people who have centered in on what seems to be a dividing line as we see unrest and protests and physical violence and property damage around the country. When we talk about property damage, there is often a debate as to whether it counts as violence in the sense of when people say, I am against violence. So most people agree attacking random bystanders who aren't being violent is unacceptable violence. Attacking random police who aren't doing anything wrong, that is violence in any sense of the word. Most people agree blocking traffic is not violence. Now, you could be for or against blocking traffic as a protest tactic, but most people would not say blocking traffic is violence. You could maybe say, well, if you prevent people from getting to work and then they lose their jobs, blocking traffic becomes kind of like economic violence. But in the kind of violence we're talking about, blocking traffic, most people agree is not violence. What about property damage? So first of all, we have to call out the right-wing hypocrites on this issue, the concern trolls who a month ago were saying sacrifice grandma to coronavirus in order to open the economy, who are now saying the worst thing you can do is break the windows of a big box store. They are hypocrites. I'm not interested in those hypocritical concern trolls. I want to deal with the real people, with the sensible people who in a real way want to talk about this. There are folks who believe that, for example, destroying government property when no one gets physically hurt is okay. But, for example, destroying a private business is not okay. That depends on who you're targeting. You could be targeting a business with bad practices, or you could be targeting a government that is a bad actor or whatever. You could find, a logging company and say, we are going to destroy or disable their bulldozers so that they cannot take down these trees. Saying what determines whether destruction of property is violence is merely whether you're doing it to a government property or to private property. I don't think that's really the dividing line. What this comes down to is, what do we mean by violence? Violence defined as behavior involving physical force to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something. Damaging property sort of fits. If you want to take a legal perspective, certainly the unlawful exercise of force or the exhibition of such force would encompass the destruction of property. Now, others would say the real crux of human violence versus physical violence against people rather than objects is where we should be focusing. If you are talking about breaking a window, that's not really what a lot of people believe is violence. So here's the bottom line. If you want to make this a semantic argument, if you want to make this about definitions, you can define violence in a way that does or doesn't include property crime. It won't really get to the underlying issue. And the underlying issue is whether sometimes violence is justified. So even if we agree on whether property crime is or is not violence, that doesn't answer the question of whether property crime, destruction of property, is a valid form of protest. Who gets to decide what's in the protesting playbook? If you leave the protesting playbook only to the elites and those in positions of power, it will be restricted to only writing letters, chanting and holding signs, right? The point is, if you let those already in power define what is okay in terms of protesting, certainly nothing will ever change. Now, is there any guarantee that destroying property is going to achieve change? There's not. We do know that destruction of property has been a part of protesting for a really long time. You look at the Boston Tea Party, destroyed property to fight back against a capitalist monopoly and political rights that were being claimed by British colonists. You look at slave uprisings in the United States, which included destruction of property. You look at the Plowshares Aid, a group of 8 Christians, including priests and nuns, who took hammers to the nose cones of some nuclear warheads, poured their blood on the facility's papers in a call for peace. So the legality part of it is clear. This stuff is illegal to do. But I think we can all, every single one of us, imagine a situation where we do the moderate methods and they bring no change. They don't get attention. And then you say, well, we don't want to do violence to people, but we're going to start destroying some property. Destruction of property, in my mind, is clearly violence of a kind, But in certain situations, it might be the only thing people have left short of starting to actually do violence to individuals. Now, which situations count? I don't know. I don't know. What about the consequences? Well, there are consequences. You're not going to get around that. Will property damage get you what you want? Often it will not. Property damage may, in fact, do the opposite. It may turn public opinion against you. But whether property damage that's not hurting anyone physically is a valid form of protest, that's a question that goes back at least hundreds of years. And anybody pretending that there is one single solitary answer that applies to every situation is just wrong. History tells us that's not the case. I want to hear from you about this. We're going to continue covering it on the David Pakman Show Instagram, @David Pakman Show. We will take a break and be back with much more.